No taxation without representation, habeas corpus, shall not be suspended. No confiscation of property without compensation. If these phrases sound familiar to you, it's because they are timeless. They are a part of what might be the most important document in history, the foundation stone of individual liberty. And guess what? It's still relevant today. 800 years after it was written, it is time to talk about the Magna Carta. Now, England at this point was ruled by King John Richard's younger brother, who was widely unpopular. He raised taxes to try to finance a war against France, which he was losing badly. He treated his barons horribly. There was just contempt between them. And so when John heard all this, he said, "Okay, here's my chance." The first is clause 39, which says, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his property. The constable of the castle or whoever else is responsible shall not be absolved from responsibility for this imprisonment until he has produced the king's writ granting him safe conduct for whatever, because he will not be entitled to use the king's name to prevent any inquiry into his actions." I get to show them where freedom comes from, where it's always existed, and how they can defend it and pass it on to future generations. That's why I am so grateful to Classical Conversations for inviting me to teach this course and to share this knowledge with you. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you next time. This clause is the origin of our idea of no taxation without representation. The idea is that the king cannot just arbitrarily tax his subjects. He needs to have a justification for doing so. And furthermore, the people should be allowed to question that justification. And by this means, a widow and a female shall not be seized, nor imprisoned, nor exiled, except by the lawful judgment of their peers. This is important because it enshrines the idea of due process into law. You can't just be deprived of your life or liberty or property. The government has to follow a certain process. Now, notice that it says in this clause that it applies only to free men. Well, who does that include? Well, the answer is everyone. The Magna Carta doesn't say, "Oh, this is only for white men who own property." It says all free men. Everyone who is free is included in this protection. And notice what it says about women. Women are included in the protections of the Magna Carta. They cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Again, this is an idea whose time has come. It's an idea whose time has come because the Magna Carta includes women. It's an idea whose time has come because the Magna Carta protects all people. I'm going to declare myself the Earl of Kent and take over the country. Unfortunately, before he could raise enough of an army to do it, a bunch of barons asked him to come be their military leader. Soon after John signed it, he went back on his word and started seizing people's property without compensating them and breaking the law. But here's the amazing thing. Although the Magna Carta failed in John's time, it succeeded in the long run. That's because ideas never truly die. They're either passed on or they're left behind. And the idea of the Magna Carta was passed on and eventually led to the American Revolution, the creation of the United States. And that's why we study this stuff, because we can see in moments like the writing of the Magna Carta, the origins of the freedom that we enjoy today. They liked John. They thought he was a good military tactician. So they hired him to go fight the French. So he spent a few years fighting the French and getting his rear end kicked. And then finally, he was able to raise a big enough army to declare himself the Earl of Kent and take over the country. And he did. He defeated the king's forces and forced King John to meet with him at Runnymede. And there they negotiated what would become the Magna Carta. So we know that government officials have no right to confiscate your property unless they pay you for it. Why do you care? Because the story of the Magna Carta is not just the story of King John and the barons. In the name of God, I, John, by the advice of the Archbishop, the Earls, and the barons, have ordained and established these freedoms for us and our heirs, forever. The first thing I want to say is that John didn't really mean forever. He meant forever during his lifetime. That's what he meant by forever. But the second thing I want to say is that despite the fact that the Magna Carta was written 800 years ago, it is still being honored. And that's why it's still relevant today. It's the story of you and me. It's the story of our rights. And here's why. First, this isn't just an old dusty document. It's the basis of our modern conception of liberty. We think of liberty as something that just exists. We don't ask ourselves where it comes from, why we have the freedom that we do. And the answer is often other people in the past who fought for our freedom. Second, it shows us how fragile freedom is. John and the barons didn't just have freedom handed to them. They had to fight for it. And it required courage and sacrifice. And third, it reminds us that we need to continually defend our freedom. That freedom isn't something that we inherit once and for all. It's something we pass on each generation, and it requires continual vigilance. But did you know that the idea of due process, the idea that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without going through a legal process, that this idea traces back to this old dusty document? It was written by a man named John, and I wanted to talk about who he was and how this thing came to be. Who was John? Well, this is a fascinating story. John was born around 1166, just north of London. His father had been a royal justice, a judge of sorts, but died when John was very young. And so John grew up with his older brother, Richard, and they kind of grew up in the royal court. They were friends with the king's son, the heir apparent. And so when the heir apparent became the king, Richard the Lionheart, John hoped that he would get some favor from the crown. But Richard wasn't interested in rewarding his childhood friend, and so John didn't get anything. So he ended up traveling over to France and becoming a knight. He had ambitions to be a great medieval warrior like Richard the Lion, but those ambitions were thwarted when King Philip II of France beat him at the Battle of Boux. So John came home and realized that if he wanted any power, he was going to have to seize it, or that the idea of no taxation without representation, that it also traces back to this ancient document. The United States Constitution does not spring out of nowhere. It builds on ideas from past generations. And one of the most important of these ideas comes from the Magna Carta. By the way, was not written by Thomas Jefferson, and so he started raising an army. Now, you might be asking yourself, why am I telling you this story? The Magna Carta begins with a famous refrain that you've probably heard. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but let's focus on two parts of it. Another important clause in the Magna Carta is Clause 12, which says, if it is found that a knight has been wrongly imprisoned in a castle or elsewhere, in the English state, on the orders of the king, the Magna Carta, by the way, was actually broken. It didn't work. The reason I love teaching is because I get to share these stories with people. For additional resources to help you teach this content to children, visit our website.